Good evening. We are meeting after a hiatus of a couple of weeks, but if you recall, we are continuing our series on diabetes, and the first two lectures were the first one was on the classification and diagnosis of diabetes, and the second lecture talked about the management of diabetes, specifically on the diabetic diet and the physical activity part. So continuing that further, today we will be talking about the management of diabetes, and we'll be concentrating upon oral drugs. So before I go ahead, I will first present few principles with respect to the use of oral drugs. The first principle is that you start with just metformin, and this is applicable to patients who are drug naive. Drug naive patient means those patients who've been just diagnosed with diabetes, and also includes other patients who've been diagnosed in the past, but they have never taken any oral drugs for diabetes. So somebody who was controlled on diabetic diet alone, or who was maybe not even controlled, but was taking some Ayurvedic medication, some other form of therapy, but not started on oral drugs. So all such patients are drug naive, and provided that patient does not have any contraindication to using metformin. So all such patients, you start with just metformin. Now, the area of confusion in this principle is that some textbooks and guidelines mention that if your A1C is very high and if you have catabolic features, then you can even give insulin in the beginning. So there is nothing against using insulin. Insulin can be used at any point of time in type 2 diabetes. But what is important is that if your patient is having catabolic symptoms and if the A1C is very high, the first thing that you should be doing is, as we discussed in the first lecture, is to question your diagnosis. Generally, type 2 diabetes does not present with catabolic features. It doesn't present with marked catabolic features, or does not present with very high A1Cs. So if you have A1C in the range of 14, 15 or something, and there is a lot of weight loss, you should first think that is it this type 1 diabetes or is this type 2 diabetes? Now, assuming that catabolic features are not there, it is said that if the A1C is 10% or more, then you think of insulin. But that is not always true, because most of the patients, at least half of the patients with type 2 diabetes that come to us, have A1C in the range of 10, 11, 12. And the majority of them achieve a normal A1C without having to resort to insulin, or for that matter, using anything more than metformin. So the reason behind why only metformin should be given, no matter how high the A1C, as long as we are confident of the diagnosis, is that metformin is not alone. Metformin is coupled with diabetic diet and with physical activity. So as we discussed, you can reduce HbA1c by up to 3% by diet and exercise alone, if done properly. Metformin will contribute another 1%. And additionally, there is a component of what is called glucotoxicity. And combined all these three, that is the lifestyle modification, metformin, and the glucotoxicity reversal, will lead to a reduction in A1C. Even 12 A1C can come down to 7 without using another drug. Now, the concept of glucotoxicity is basically this, that if the patient has very high blood glucose, then that glucose itself is toxic to the beta cells, and it puts them in sort of a dormant phase in which even the alive cells do not work as they should be working. But as the blood glucose comes down, these dormant beta cells restart working, and therefore there is an improvement in the glycemic status. One way of looking at it is in this way, that if a diabetic patient comes to you and you start them on insulin, you will find that they require large amount of insulin if you want to control the blood glucose within a few days. But once the blood glucose becomes normal, suddenly the insulin requirement begins to go down, and then eventually patient settles on a much lower dose of insulin that was given in the beginning. So the reason for this is that the beta cells were not working at all in the beginning, but once you lowered the glucose, the beta cells began to again start working to some extent. So because of this reason, a very high A1C is not a valid reason to jump up to using multiple drugs in the first step. Okay. So principle number one, start with metformin alone. Don't go for more than one drug because of high A1C. But it is important to understand that you have to ensure that diabetic diet and physical activity is properly advised. The second principle is that when you add a second drug, it is only after you've escalated the previous drug to the maximal possible limit. What I mean by maximum possible escalation is that suppose the total dose of metformin that you can give theoretically is 2 grams. But that particular patient began to have a lot of GI symptoms at 1.5 grams, and then you could not go to 2 grams. So in this case, the 1.5 grams is the maximum possible escalation, and it is justified for you to add a new drug if the 1.5 gram metformin is not working. But on the other hand, if you start somebody on metformin 500 milligrams, and then when blood glucose does not come down and you add a second drug, then that is incorrect because you have not escalated the dose of metformin properly, right? So you should first, whatever drug you're using, first go to the maximum dose and only then go to the second drug. And this principle is actually applicable in hypertension also. It is quite common to see that a patient is getting only 40 milligrams of telmisartan, and then somebody's added amlodipine on top of it, and then somebody's added hydrochlorothiazide on top of it. Whenever you are escalating, you should first maximize the dose of the drugs that you are already giving, and only then you should go for a second drug. The third principle, which is very important and often missed, is that you should not increase the dose or add a new drug without ensuring the compliance to diabetic diet and exercise. As we discussed earlier, diet and exercise can cause a 3% reduction in A1C, whereas there is no drug which causes more than 1% reduction. Therefore, the contribution of diet and exercise cannot be ignored. And if you find that patient is on metformin, let's say, and the blood glucose is high, the first step is to find out have they been advised diet and exercise properly, and if they've been advised, are they following it properly? Because if they are not doing that, adding more drugs is not going to solve the problem. Therefore, whenever we meet a patient, whenever we take a decision about increasing the dose or adding a new drug, we always question them, what is the diet advice to you? To what extent are you able to follow it? And if you find that they are not following the diet at all, then in such cases, you should ideally not increase the dose, just advise them that it is not the medicine which is not working. It is the other things that you should be doing that you're not doing that is causing the high blood glucose. So you can send them back with just advice to follow the diet and exercise if they are not following at all. So that is principle number 3. Principle number 4 is do not increase the dose or add new drug without checking drug compliance. Now this is very commonsensical, very logical. If you advise somebody to take 500 BD metformin and they come back with a high blood glucose, the first question you should ask them is, have you even eaten this drug properly? So it is a common rookie mistake to assume that if you prescribe the drug, patient must be taking the drug, but nothing is farther from the truth. Drug compliance is a major issue. Even people who are very religious about their medication will end up taking only 80% of the time. That is the kind of number that you will find if you try to do a study. 20% of the time, even the most dedicated of people will miss the drug because there are several things going on in your life. You are busy, you are traveling, XYZ, somebody came over, you forgot to take the medicine. And when you are doing something every day, it is very easy to, forget whether you did it today or you did it the previous day or something like that. So, but apart from that, this is what we all take as acceptable. 80% I will take without cribbing. But most of the patients will take the drug less frequently because either they had some side effects, somebody told them it's not good for them, or they didn't want to take too much medication. They can have a wide variety of reasons. But you need to first ask them, are you taking the medicine properly? Are you taking it regularly? Only then you should think of increasing the dose. Because if they have not taken the previous dose properly, then you can't assess the response, and then there is no rationale behind increasing the dose. So don't be in a hurry to, the moment you see high blood glucose, don't be in a hurry to immediately increase the dose or add a second drug. You need to ask a lot of questions before you go on to increasing the dose. Then principle number 5, which is often violated, not only by young trainees like you, but by almost all the practitioners that we encounter in the private world. If you are giving 3 drugs and the blood glucose is still not coming down, then most likely it means that the patient is not having adequate beta cell function, and therefore it is generally a signal that insulin is required. Whenever we start a drug, the first drug in a drug naive patient will have the maximal response. That is, it will perform to the full potential. For example, metformin, let's say, can do 1% reduction, and you start off metformin in a drug naive patient, then you can expect to see 1%. But you add the second drug, let's say glimepiride, to it, which also does 1%. But when you will add on top of metformin, the result will be a little bit lesser. It will not perform exactly 1%. It will be less than 1%. And when you add on the third drug, its response again will be a little bit lesser. So it's not a clearly incremental effect. In fact, every new drug that you add will perform a little inferior to what it would have performed as monotherapy. And generally, when you are using 3 drugs, it generally means that all diabetes duration must have been longer. It must be around for more than 10-15 years. And at that point of time, the beta cell dysfunction becomes more prominent. And it means that you will have to add insulin. So the drugs are not going to work in patients who have poor beta cell function. If the beta cell function is adequate, only then you can expect that the oral drugs will work. If the beta cell function is gone down, then you will have to give injectables. So if 3 drugs are failing, the 4th drug is not going to cut it. It is useless to add a 4th drug. Therefore, do not go more than 3 drugs. And if you are trying 4 drugs, then you are unnecessarily delaying the initiation of insulin, and it's not going to benefit the patient in any way. So these are the basic principles of giving the oral drug therapy. These principles are not from some textbook, but of course there can be references to each one of them. But these are the principles which I think you must be kept in mind when you are giving the prescribing the oral drugs. Now, these principles will apply mostly to patients who are drug naive. But what if you encounter somebody who is already on some drugs? So if you find some person who is already having diabetes and was taking some medication, first step is of course the same. You have to ask them, are you following diabetic diet? Are you doing exercise? What about your drug compliance? This medicine, are you taking it regularly? These are the initial questions, because these help you set the baseline. If they're on some drug but the compliance is poor, then you cannot assess the response of that drug. You can't make out anything from blood glucose. If they're not doing diet and exercise, then again, you cannot really interpret what is happening with the blood glucose. Then assuming that these things are in place, that they're following a diet and they are doing exercise and the drug compliance is good, the next step is you have to see, is the regimen rational? What I mean by the regimen being rational is that whosoever was treating the patient began with metformin, and then he looked for the response. When there was no response, he escalated the dose of metformin properly. Once the full dose was reached, then and there was no response, then he went on to add the second drug, then escalated the second drug, and so on and so forth. So this is a rational regimen. On the other hand, if somebody is taking a triple drug combination of metformin, glimepiride, and voglibose, which are commonly available in the market, I don't know why that stupid regimen is out there, but some people are taking two tablets of these. So that will give you sort of a half dose of metformin, a half dose of glimepiride, and another half dose of voglibose. So none of the 3 are fully escalated. So that is not a rational regimen. So you cannot really interpret the rational regimen. You should think of completely changing that regimen. But if the regimen is rational, then you can think of continuing the same regimen or building upon that regimen when you see the patient. Now, if the regimen is not rational, then next question you want to know is, what is the duration of diabetes? So basically, you're going to take a call that am I going to give them only one drug? Am I going to give them 2 drugs or 3 drugs? So for that, what I do is I ask them the duration of diabetes. Now, the reason for asking the duration of diabetes is that in a typical diabetic patient, in the first 3 to 4 or maybe even 5 years of diabetes, metformin alone will be enough to control the blood glucose. Of course, there will be cases in which metformin will work for 15 years also and not require a second drug. And there will be some patients who will start failing metformin in 2 years. But on average, I would say at least 4 to 5 years, metformin alone works, provided you are doing diet and exercise, of course. And then after that, 2 drugs are usually good enough for up to 10 years for most patients. And generally, when you go past 10 years, then diabetes becomes even worse. And then you generally have to go for 3 drugs. So if I have to take a call, and if I don't have that information about the proper regimen, how the patient was taking it, I will use this as a rough guide. And if it is only 4-5 years of diabetes, I'll stop everything else and I put only metformin. If it is up more than 5 years, up to 10 years, then I will maybe put with 2 drugs. And if it is more than 3 drugs and blood glucose is not controlled, I'll go for 3 drugs. So this is how we can do it practically. So now with these broad guidelines about initiating and escalating the drugs, we will now move on to the drug classification. So this is the classification of oral drugs. So number one, you've got biogonides, and there is only one drug in this class, and that is metformin. The second group is insulin secretagogues, and the most common subcategory is sulfonylureas, which includes glimepiride, gliclazide, and glipizide. There are many others, but these are the 3 which are more commonly used. And then you have a category called glinides, which includes repaglinide, netaglinide, which again are not very popular in India. Then you have the DPP-4 inhibitors. These are sitagliptin, saxagliptin, linagliptin, vildagliptin. And you've got the SGLT2 inhibitors. These are empagliflozin, dapagliflozin, canagliflozin. And I'm only naming the ones which are commonly used in the country. And then you have the PPR agonists, in which only pioglitazone is available. Apart from that, you also have alpha glucosidase inhibitors such as acarbose and voglibose. You've got bile acid sequestrants, dopamine agonists, but these are drugs which are less commonly used, and they have a lesser efficacy, therefore not preferred. So metformin, as you already know, metformin is the first line drug. In terms of mechanism, there are several mechanisms by which metformin works, and there is no consensus about which of them is the dominant mechanism. But it could be affecting the AMP kinase pathway and reducing the hepatic glucose output. It could also be giving some neural signals from the gut in terms of satiety, and it could be influencing the gut microbiome. It could be increasing the GLP levels. In some, to some extent, it can also change the insulin sensitivity. So metformin is available in immediate release preparation, that is a plain metformin, and also in an SR preparation or a sustained release preparation. So the immediate release is to be taken twice daily, whereas the sustained release can be taken once daily, but also can be given twice daily if the dose is high. So theoretically, the maximum dose of metformin that you can give is 2550, that is 850 milligrams TDS. But there is a concept in diabetes of maximum effective dose. So maximum effective dose is that dose at which you will get the maximum benefits of the drug. And theoretically, you can go to the maximum dose, but when you go from the maximum effective dose to maximum dose, you don't gain much in terms of glycemic response, but you may increase the adverse effects. So in case of metformin, the maximum effective dose is 2 grams. So in general, our target when we're giving metformin is to go to 2 grams of metformin, and we don't try to go to 2550, because nothing much has to be gained by going from 2000 to 2550. Now, what are the adverse effects of metformin? So the most common adverse effects of metformin is the gastrointestinal effects. People complain of dyspepsia, heartburn, regurgitation, and nausea. And some of them can have diarrhea, some can have constipation also. So in order to blunt out or take care of these effects, there are several ways in which we can encounter these. Number one is gradual escalation. So you always start off metformin with a 500 mg OD kind of dose, and then after 1 week you increase to 500 BD. And then depending upon what dose you want to target, you can increase further on, stay at that 500 BD. So that is one way to minimize the GI effects. To start with a smaller dose and gradually build upwards. Then second thing could be that you use a smaller dose. A lot of patients can tolerate up to 1 gram very well, but they have symptoms when you go to 1.5 or 2 grams. So in such cases, you can just go to 1 gram, and then if that doesn't work, you can go on to the next drug. Other option can be that instead of the immediate release or the plain preparation, you can use a sustained release preparation, that is the SR preparations. Some people have less adverse effects with the SR, although some have more with SR, so those also there. And sometimes changing the brand also helps. You go from one brand to the other brand with the same preparation, you still get a better response. So that is in practice that also we see sometimes. And another modality could be that you add a proton pump inhibitor for a couple of weeks. Generally, these GI effects of metformin are sort of self-resolving over a period of time, And if you can tide over a couple of weeks with the proton pump inhibitor, sometimes people tolerate the drug well. So because metformin is an important component of the diabetes management, you try to do everything to ensure that the patient is able to take at least some quantity of metformin, because it really limits the number of options that you have if you are not able to give metformin. Then second adverse effect is vitamin B12 deficiency. You are already aware that metformin can interfere with B12 absorption and cause deficiency. So this is one concern. But the typical B12 deficiency that you would have seen, pancytopenia, macrocytic anemias, or the typical neuropathy, myelopathy, that picture is clinically not very common in diabetic patients. A lot of patients have diabetes, almost all of them are taking metformin. And as it is, patients are B12 deficient. Indian diet is deficient in B12. But we don't really see florid B12 deficiencies. Maybe mild subclinical deficiencies out could be there. But anyway, it is what it is. So and then the third is the most talked about and the most dreaded complication, which is lactic acidosis, also called MALA, metformin associated lactic acidosis. So whether metformin actually causes lactic acidosis is still not clear. Metformin's earlier congener, that was fenformin, definitely causes lactic acidosis, and that is the reason why it is no longer available. With metformin, there has been no case in which the lactic acidosis can be attributed just to metformin. Whenever it was reported, patients already had some other conditions which were known to be causing lactic acidosis. So this is a table which shows the causes of lactic acidosis. It is type A and type B, which is type A is because of underperfusion and hypoxia, and type B is without that. So you can see any type of shock, any hypoxia, anemia, and then you have got other toxins. Then liver failure and kidney failure not mentioned here, but that is also there. So all these can cause lactic acidosis. And if any of these are operational, giving metformin alongside may worsen the acidosis. That is the whole theory behind withdrawing metformin whenever you think there is a risk of lactic acidosis. So what to do in case of CKD? Earlier, you used to read that if you have a creatinine of 1.5, 1.4, you stop metformin, but that is no longer accepted. First step is that you have to calculate the estimated GFR. So this should be done practically for all the conditions, because creatinine itself does not tell you much. The same creatinine, a person who's older and who's having less body weight, less body surface area, is going to have a worse eGFR, whereas a younger patient who is heavier may have a better eGFR. So you cannot really just look at creatinine and tell what is the GFR. You have to do a calculation, and for that it is preferable to use the MDRD or the CKD EPI formula. So nowadays there are a lot of apps which are available which have these formulae. So it is a good idea to download those apps on your mobile, and whenever you are faced with a patient who has a renal dysfunction, you should immediately calculate the eGFR and accordingly define the extent of the renal dysfunction. So if your eGFR is more than 45 ml per minute, you don't need to change the metformin. You can give metformin whatever dose you want to give. If the eGFR is between 30 to 45, you do not start metformin in a fresh patient. And if the patient was already on metformin, you need to reduce the dose to 1000 milligrams per day or lesser. But if your eGFR is below 30, then it is advisable to stop or withdraw the metformin or not initiate metformin. Even at eGFRs below 30, there are a lot of patients who are, who were found to be taking metformin, but we've never encountered or heard of anybody going into lactic acidosis because of metformin alone. So maybe in future this cutoff will come down lower, we do not know. So whenever we talk about any diabetic drug, there are 3-4 things which is typically compared or asked for, and those include the effect on hypoglycemia, the effect on the weight, the cardiovascular effects, and the cost of the drug. So in terms of hypoglycemia, metformin does not cause hypoglycemia on its own, because it cannot change the insulin levels, does not increase the insulin levels, that is. Therefore, the risk of hypoglycemia with metformin is almost negligible. So that is a good thing. In terms of weight, metformin does not cause weight gain, and some patients can actually lose some weight, although the weight gain is not dramatic. It's generally 2 to 3 kgs. There'll be occasional patients who'll say that they've lost more weight. So that can happen in some patients, but in general, the weight loss with metformin is modest. So that is again something which is good, because if you gain weight in a diabetic patient, then your insulin resistance is going to go worse, and then your risk of other complications like hypertension, CAD, etc. also increases. So the target of a diabetic patient is to lose weight. So any drug which helps you lose weight or at least prevents you from gaining weight is welcome. So that is again in favor of metformin. Then third is CV effects. So in type 2 diabetes, the major cause of death is cardiovascular deaths. It can be because of MI or stroke. So drugs which have shown to reduce the CV mortality are kind of preferred for patients with diabetes, and even more so for those with CAD or CVA. So with metformin, there is no large-scale recent data, but the UK PDS study, which was the landmark study in type 2 diabetes, showed that patients who were on metformin had lower CV mortality. So that data is still accepted, and therefore metformin is supposed to have CV benefits, and therefore metformin is the preferred drug as a first line. Cost-wise, again, metformin is among the cheapest of the oral drugs, and that is again something which is positive. So now we've talked about metformin, and now we move on to the insulin secretagogues. So insulin secretagogues, as we discussed, are basically two groups. The first one is sulfonylureas or SUs, and these include drugs like glimepiride, gliclazide, glipizide, and glibenclamide. Out of these, glibenclamide is the older generation drug and generally not available, but I still find occasionally some of the dispensaries in the city are carrying Dianyl. Dianyl is the brand name of glibenclamide, and there are some occasional patients who are still taking Dianyl. Dianyl is very cheap, it seems, and I don't know, somehow some hospitals still have the stock. So glibenclamide is not a very preferred drug because of its very long half-life, and it has a higher risk of hypoglycemia. So wherever you find somebody on glibenclamide, quickly stop it and put him on some of the newer ones. How do they act? They bind to the sulfonylurea 1 receptor on the beta cells and increase the insulin release, and that's why they call insulin secretagogues. So doses, the most common drug out of this category is glimepiride. Glimepiride is probably the cheapest also of the lot, and it is very commonly used. The glimepiride, generally you start off with 1 mg, and the maximum dose is actually 8 milligrams, but the maximum effective dose is only 4 milligrams. So if you have giving 4 milligrams of glimepiride a day, then if you increase from 4 to 6, you should not expect to see a major change in the blood glucose, but the risk of hypoglycemia may go up. So technically you can go up to 8 mg of glimepiride, but generally after 4 mg, we do not increase the dose further and we move on to the next drug. Right. So the maximal effective dose for glimepiride is 4 milligrams. Gliclazide is a shorter acting drug, so it comes as a plain preparation in which is 80 milligrams of gliclazide, and it has to be given twice daily. And then there are some extended release preparations of gliclazide, such as gliclazide MR, that is diamicron MR, diamicron XR. These are basically extended release preparations of gliclazide, and again they can be given once daily. Glipizide again supposed to be given more than 2 or 3 doses a day. So among these, the most commonly used drug is glimepiride. To some extent, gliclazide is also used. Glipizide is not very commonly used. Now, in renal failure, the risk of hypoglycemia goes up substantially, because most of these drugs get metabolized, and they have active metabolites also. And in renal failure, these metabolites can circulate, and then they can cause more hypoglycemia. Now, there is no contraindication to using secretagogues as such, that there is so-and-so GFR, you stop the secretagogue. But there is always the advisory that the risk of hypoglycemia will go up, and therefore the doses must be reduced or that can be stopped. So glimepiride is actually the most common cause of OHA-induced hypoglycemia that you are going to see. And the most important reason for that is it is also the most commonly used. So of course it will be the most common culprit in terms of hypoglycemia also. And patients who have renal dysfunction, patients who are older in age, will have a lower EGFR. Such patients very commonly are susceptible to hypoglycemias, and many of them will land up in your emergencies in unconscious states. And whenever it is because of drugs, it is invariably glimepiride. So there is a lot of caution should be exercised. You have to look at the blood glucose. If the blood glucose is really teetering towards the lower end of normal, then it is a good idea to stop the drug. And whenever you encounter any patient who has had a severe hypoglycemia, that means hypoglycemia requiring hospitalization or assistance of somebody else, then in such patients, I always stop the sulfonylurea and never restart it, because the risk to life is really, really huge. So what about the 4 parameters? Hypoglycemia is the major adverse effect of sulfonylureas. So sulfonylureas are very well tolerated otherwise. Apart from the hypoglycemia, they hardly cause any other, perceptible hardship to the patient. Most patients are very happy with sulfonylureas, but hypoglycemia is an important concern. Then weight gain, they cause weight gain. They increase the insulin secretion, and insulin secretion causes you to feel hungry and eat more. And insulin itself is an anabolic hormone. It will cause you to gain more fat. So the weight increases with SU. So in obese patients, they are not a very good choice. And therefore, this is one point that is against them. In terms of CV effects, there was earlier some discussion that the sulfonylureas have adverse effects on the heart, because they can also bind to the SUR2 receptor on the cardiac cells, and they can cause either arrhythmias, or they can prevent the ischemic preconditioning, which is a protective mechanism against cardiac ischemia. But the data has not supported these hypotheses, and although they are not preferred drugs for patients with cardiac problems, but still there is no reason to not prescribe them in the general population with respect to the cardiac effects. In terms of cost, they are not very expensive. At least the glimepiride is among the cheaper drugs that is around there. It's not as cheap as metformin, but still fairly cheap. Gliclazide and glipizide, etc., may be more costly. Then glinides, these include nataglinide and repaglinide. These are the short-acting sulfonylureas, or not sulfonylureas, they're short-acting secretagogues, and they have to be given at least 3 times a day, that is before each meal. They are very expensive, at least in India, and they work only on the postprandial blood glucose. They will not act on the fasting glucose. So in very rare conditions, when you are really worried about the hypoglycemia and you've run out of other options, you might want to go to glinides, but it's not something which is used commonly. Now we come to the DPP-4 inhibitors. These include drugs like sitagliptin, saxagliptin, linagliptin, vildagliptin. In our hospital, vildagliptin is the most commonly used because it is available in the pharmacy, and vildagliptin is among the more potent of the DPP-4 inhibitors. But overall, they are not a very effective kind of drugs. Their potency as compared to their efficacy as compared to metformin and glimepiride is much less. A1C reduction close to 0.5 to 0.7% is what you can maximally expect from them. So they act via the incretin effect. Incretin effect, if you're not aware, is that the insulin response to IV glucose is much less as compared to oral glucose. That is, whenever you eat food, the insulin response will be faster. And the reason for the incretin effect is that the gut senses that food is coming, and the intestinal cells secrete GLP-1, and the GLP-1 goes and elicits a more robust response from the beta cells. Now, how do DPP-4 inhibitors work? They basically inhibit the DPP-4 enzyme, and this enzyme is responsible for metabolizing the GLP-1. So if you inhibit the DPP-4 enzyme, you increase the level of endogenous GLP-1. On the other hand, you also have GLP-1 agonists, which are mostly injectables. So they also work by the same mechanism, but here also mechanism is basically potentiation of GLP-1 action, and then the GLP-1 will cause the increased insulin secretion and therefore improve the blood glucose. So doses, sitagliptin comes in the dose of 50 to 100 milligrams a day. Vildagliptin is supposed to be given twice daily, 50 mg BD, that is. Sitagliptin can be given 100 OD. Then linagliptin is 5 mg OD. So the doses vary. Saxagliptin, I'm not sure of the dose because it's not very commonly used. I rarely use saxagliptin. I think it is also OD. Then in renal failure, if you have CKD stage 3 or lesser, then you will have to reduce doses for vildagliptin and sitagliptin. Generally, you give Vilda 50 OD or Sita 50 OD if you have renal failure, that is CKD stage 3 or lower. Linagliptin is not metabolized, is not excreted by the kidney, and therefore you need not reduce the dose of linagliptin, even in patients who are in kidney stage 5. So you can give the full dose. There are some contraindications to DPP-4 inhibitors. There have been reports of pancreatitis with patients taking DPP-4. Therefore, if there is a history of pancreatitis, then you should not give DPP-4 inhibitors. And the trial on saxagliptin had shown that it had increased the hospitalization for heart failure. So therefore, if there is a decompensated heart failure, then probably DPP-4 inhibitors can be avoided, although sitagliptin did not show the same result in its trial. Again, we come to the 4 parameters. DPP-4 inhibitors do not cause hypoglycemia because they don't directly increase insulin levels. If you go through the GLP-1 route, you will only increase the glucose-mediated insulin secretion. So it will potentiate the response to a meal, but it will not cause hyperinsulinemia in a fasting state. So you will not have hypoglycemias. In terms of weight, they are weight neutral. They don't cause weight gain, but they also don't cause much weight loss. CV effects, they have been found to be CV neutral in most trials, but there is a risk of heart failure with saxagliptin, and that has been kind of extrapolated to the others as well. So if you have somebody with heart failure, you should should avoid giving DPP-4, especially if it is history of decompensation is there. In terms of cost, DPP-4 inhibitors are among the costlier drugs. They were quite costly in the beginning because of the patent issues, but now the vildagliptin patent has expired, and now a lot of manufacturers are making vildagliptin. So at one point of time, the tablet was around 30 rupees for one tablet, but now the cost is coming down to 8 to 9 rupees per tablet. So the cost has reduced, but still much costly as compared to metformin and glimepiride. So we've got just a minute left in this session, so I'm going to stop here, and let's join into the second session to continue. Right. So now we come to SGLT2 inhibitors. SGLT2 inhibitors are the kind of the newer drugs, although they've been around for quite some time now. These include drugs like empagliflozin, canagliflozin, dapagliflozin. The mechanism of these drugs is, as the name says, as inhibition of the SGLT2 transporter in the kidneys, and because of this, they affect the reabsorption of glucose, and the amount of glucose that is excreted in the urine increases. So the patient will continue to have glycosuria even below the renal threshold, and because of this, there will be reduction in blood glucose. There will be a reduction in the weight. They will also lose a lot of water in the urine, so there will be some dehydration also, and that helps with the blood pressure. So this is how the SGLT2 inhibitors work. Dose-wise, empagliflozin dose is 10 mg to 20 to 25 milligrams. Dapagliflozin comes as 5 and 10 milligrams. If the EGFR falls below 45 ml per minute, then you should not be using these drugs if they are contraindicated. In terms of adverse effects, the adverse effects with SGLT2 inhibitors are, number one is UTI. So because they cause glycosuria, so there is a lot of glucose in the urine, so the urinary tract is flushed with glucose, and the risk of getting urinary tract infections, that is mostly lower UTI, lower urinary tract infections becomes more, and even genital myocardial infections can also be increased. So ensuring good hygiene and drinking plenty of water is important. The second adverse effects is orthostatic hypotension, because as we discussed, they cause dehydration, and because of that the blood pressure can fall, and people may have episode of orthostatic hypotension, and they may even fall. So adequate water intake is important. And there's something that has been observed with these drugs is a euglycemic decay. That is, despite having a glucose in the normal territory that is less than 250, you can still go into decay. Now, whether this happens in type 2 diabetes is questionable. Probably these patients were having a component of type 1, or they may be losing their insulin secretion. But anyway, if you find somebody who's taking SGLT2 inhibitors and he has some features of decay, you should always think of euglycemic decay. Now, in the trials of the individual drugs, some other adverse effects have come into light. Lower extremity amputations were increased with canagliflozin. but that was not shown in the other trials. There was an increase in fracture risk, which is being attributable to probably orthostatic hypotension causing falls. Whether the drugs can cause osteoporosis on their own is not clear. There were some reports of Fournier's gangrene, which is a very nasty infection. And there was also some scare about a bladder risk carcinoma, bladder carcinoma risk with dapagliflozin. Again, so it is advisable not to use in patients who have bladder cancer. So SGLT2 inhibitors have a lot of positive features in terms of hypoglycemia. They do not cause hypoglycemia. They can cause a reasonable amount of weight loss. Patients may lose up to 5 to 6 kgs also of weight on these drugs. So they're a good option for patients who are obese. The trials on SGLT2 inhibitors have shown that they can reduce the CV mortality, and that has been something which has really excited the medical community the world over. Actually, in 2008, the FDA mandated that before giving approval to any new drug, the drug must conduct a CV outcome trial and show that it is not worsening the CV outcome. So what they wanted to know is that because most patients in diabetes are dying out of cardiovascular diseases, whatever new drug we are adding must not add to that mortality. It should be at least neutral, if not beneficial. So because of this reason, these trials are now being done for all the drugs, and these drugs have come out of after 2008. So all of them had the CV outcome trial. And in the CV outcome trials of SGLT2 inhibitors, benefits on the CV outcome were found. The CV mortality was lower to some extent. In some of the trials, even the number of events were lesser. And because of this reason, they are now being recommended as the preferred drugs for patients who are having existing cardiovascular disease. If you ask me, I have some reservations about the data. I don't think the data is very robust. I think the hue and cry is more than substance. But I will not discuss that in detail out here because that will probably make this video a little too long. But I might do a separate video on the SGLT2 inhibitors, and then we can discuss why I think that the data is not that robust. Anyway, but as it stands, SGLT2 inhibitors are among the drugs which can potentially reduce CV mortality and reduce the CV events. In terms of cost, they are really expensive. They have been developed recently and they are under patent, and the costs are upward of 30 to 40 rupees per tablet, which puts them out of range for most people. And interestingly, in some of the recent studies, even the renal function also supposedly benefits from SGLT2 inhibitors. The progression to progression to dialysis requiring CKD, the worsening of proteinuria, and the increase in creatinine, all these have shown to be occurring slower in patients who are on SGLT2 as compared to the placebo and other drugs. So that is another thing which is coming to light, that probably they also have some renal benefits. But again, the same thing, I don't really concur that it is that robust relationship, because I think that the data is not clean. But anyway, as the guideline stands, apparently these are drugs which can improve the renal function as well. So then we come to the glitazones. Glitazones have quite sort of fallen out of favor. The only drug in this category is now pioglitazone, which is very uncommon, not very commonly used. Mechanism-wise, they bind to the PPR gamma receptors, and they cause a variety of pleiotropic effects in different organs, and they can increase insulin sensitivity in different tissues. They can increase the glucose uptake in muscles, etc. So there are a variety of effects which they have. They also have some beneficial effects upon the lipid profile. Doses wise, pioglitazone is generally started as 15 milligrams a day and can be increased to 45 milligrams per day. It is contraindicated in liver disease, and such patients you cannot use glitazones. In terms of adverse effects, they can cause weight gain, and part of this weight gain is because of increase in the fat, and because of this reason, doctors do not prefer to use it. But importantly, glitazones cause increase in peripheral fat and not visceral fat. So metabolically, it may not be a bad thing, but of course, weight gain is not good. It doesn't look very good, and peripheral fat also is not very acceptable for the patient. Therefore, this is one negative point. They also cause fluid retention, and that also contributes to weight gain. Further, the fluid retention is not desirable in patients with the chronic kidney disease and those with heart failure. So that is again one reason not to use glitazones. Then glitazones have been associated with increased in fracture and increase in osteoporosis. This is probably because they, through the PPR receptor, they shift the cells which are destined to become osteocytes to becoming adipocytes, and probably because of this reason they cause osteoporosis. And then again, there was the story of bladder cancer with pioglitazone. The studies which reported this bladder cancer were not very robust studies, but there were a couple of studies which said that patients who took pioglitazone for a long time had more bladder cancer than those who did not. And then later on, there were a lot of studies which could not confirm this risk. And now pioglitazone can be used and should be avoided in people who have a history of bladder cancer. But this bladder cancer story was sort of a last nail in the coffin for pioglitazone, and since then the prescription levels have really dropped to a very low level. Then you've got the alpha glucosidase inhibitors, which are not very good drugs in terms of efficacy. They act by inhibiting this enzyme in the brush border of the intestinal epithelium, so alpha glucose will not be released from the food, and therefore the absorption will be decreased. In terms of dosing, they have to be given with each meal, so it has to be a tedious kind of a dose. And the main adverse effects are the GI adverse effects, mainly flatulence. So they are very uncomfortable for the patient. They are costly. They are not cheap, and the efficacy, as I discussed, is not very great. They can only reduce the postprandial glucose to some extent, and compliance again is not very good because it is multiple times a day, and then it causes the GI upsets and all that. So the real world efficacy of alpha glucosidase inhibitor is really poor. And when you just want to give 3 drugs, then this is a sort of a useless add-on. Then you've got bromocriptine, colesevelam, and HCQS. The data is the most fuzzy on HCQS and hardly used at all. Even colesevelam and the bromocriptine are not very commonly used drugs. The efficacy is also not very good, and there are several efficacious drugs which are out there which we've discussed. So not a lot of attention goes to these 3. So that sort of winds up our discussion about the drugs. Now I'll put a note about brand names. So when you will see prescriptions of patients who are coming to you from outside, they'll be carrying some brand name. Now there are a very large number of pharmaceutical companies in the market, and diabetes is their major market because there's so many patients with diabetes. So a major chunk of the revenues come from selling the diabetes drugs. So each company will definitely name their drugs in a different way, and then they have double 2 drug combination, 3 drug combinations, and weird kind of combinations which you would never want to use, but still they produce them, and they continue to entice the private practitioners to prescribe these drugs by various methods. So there's a lot of confusion in terms of the dose and strength of the dose. But broadly, the abbreviation GP stands for glimepiride, and M stands for metformin. And when you see the word fort, it means a higher dose. For example, glycomet GP1 is 500 milligrams of metformin. That met is metformin, and GP is glimepiride. So it is 1 milligram glimepiride and 500 milligrams of metformin. And when you say glycomet GP1 fort, generally it's supposed to mean 1 mg of glimepiride and 1000 milligrams of metformin. So the fort means the metformin is double. But again, these rules are not these are no rules as such. This is just the convention. So some people may not use that, and some fort may be different from the other fort. So you should not really trust the brand name itself. You should always ask the patient to bring the strip to you and then read the info from that strip. The other option that you can do is that if you have a prescription and the patient can't get his hands on the strip, then you can use some apps. One app which I'm going to show, this is the 1mg app. This is an app which sells drugs. And if you type the name of the drug, then you can get the composition of the drug and the doses. So I found a very weird prescription by some, I think probably it was not even MBBS, some BAMS or something, which had prescribed Glixambi. And I never heard of Glixambi. When I searched it, I found that it's a combination of SGLT2 inhibitor with DPP4. So as I said, weird combinations, but they still managed to sell it. Anyway, so one tablet is 66 rupees. So you can see the expense right there. So you can download these apps and you can make use of them to get your head around what drug the patient is taking. Now comes to the question that you start with metformin. How do you decide what is the second drug to be given? So the second drug choice depends upon the patient characteristics, what kind of patient you are dealing with, what is the main issue with the patient. So one way of doing it is by going by this RSSDI therapeutic wheel. So as you see in this wheel, you have these letters in the center, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and these describe the patient characteristics. So A stands for advancing age, B stands for BMI, C for CKD, D for duration of diabetes, E for established cardiovascular disease, and then F for finance, that is financial issues, G for glycemic status, and H for hypoglycemia. So if somebody is elderly, that is A for age, then you would probably, after metformin, think of giving them either glinides, or you can give them alpha glucosidase inhibitors, or you can give them short-acting sulfonylurea, so and so forth. So accordingly, you see the choice depends. Somebody who's having a high BMI, you will not give them sulfonylureas. You will probably want to give them DPP-4 inhibitors or SGLT2 inhibitors to reduce the weight. Somebody who's got CKD, again, you will not give the drugs which are not supposed to be given in CKD. Somebody who's had hypoglycemia, will not give them sulfonylureas. You can give them the rest of the drugs. So this is how you look at the patient. What is the main issues with the patient? Is the the weight a major issues? Hypoglycemia is an issue. Does he have CKD? So for somebody who's having a CAD, you will prefer to use SGLT2 inhibitors rather than sulfonylureas after metformin. So this is how the decision making occurs. So this is the RSSDI wheel. This you can see this. It's not a very clear image, but you can get the text from the net, and you can look at that wheel. And this is how the ADA tells you how to do. So if you think it is ASCVD, then you think of giving SGLT2 or a GLP-1 agonist, that are the injectable therapies. If you have heart failure, again, you think of SGLT2. If you need to minimize hypoglycemia, then these are the options. If you want to minimize the cost, then you go for sulfonylureas or pioglitazone. So this is basically the whole idea, is that the second drug depends upon what kind of patient you are seeing, and depending upon the kind of patient, you have to choose the drug. So then I'll come to the summary. The principles of prescribing the drugs, as I discussed in the beginning, must be followed. That is, you must start off with metformin. Then you must at every step check the compliance to the diet, to the drug, and the exercise. And then you should first escalate the drug to the maximum possible dose, and then move to the second drug. And lastly, you should not go to more than 3 drugs. You should stop at 3 drugs. You can switch around. You can, after 2, if you're using 3 drugs and you think it's not working, you can remove one and put another one, but don't complicate things by going to 4 drugs. Then next is, you have to choose the drug as per patient profile. First drug is metformin, then second drug depending upon the patient profile when you have to use it. Whenever you are choosing a drug, think of the patient profile, and then also look at contraindications. For example, somebody having pancreatitis, you will not give DPP-4 or GLP-1. So you must be aware that what are the contraindications. You must keep that in mind. And also keep in mind the adverse effects of that drug. If the adverse effects are not suitable for that condition, then you should not use that particular drug. So these are in brief how you should handle oral drugs with diabetes. And